When people talk about the muscle car wars, the spotlight usually falls on Hemis, big block Chevys, screaming small block Fords, and the high-profile icons like the Dodge Charger, Mustang Boss 429, and Plymouth Hemi Cuda. But here's what most enthusiasts forget. General Motors had a secret weapon buried deep in their engineering arsenal. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't advertised on billboards, and it wasn't something you'd see stamped across the hood like a shaker scoop. Yet, this hidden piece of engineering tilted the battlefield in GM's favor and gave their cars an advantage that competitors struggled to match. Detroit doesn't like to talk about it because this one innovation threatened to upend the entire balance of muscle car performance, forcing rivals to play catch-up. This isn't just another story about horsepower numbers or engine sizes. This is about something more fundamental, something that allowed GM to take ordinary cars and transform them into legends. And once you know what this hidden weapon was, you'll never look at Chevrolet, Pontiac, Oldsmobile, or Buick the same way again. If you've ever wondered why certain GM cars dominated the streets and strips despite competitors boasting bigger, louder engines, you need to hear this. By the time you finish this journey, you'll understand how one overlooked engineering decision helped create some of the most unstoppable machines in American history. Stay locked in, because this isn't just history, it's a reminder of how clever design can beat brute force every time. The muscle car battleground. The muscle car wars of the 1960s and early 1970s are often remembered as a horsepower arms race. Automakers kept stuffing bigger engines into mid-size coupes, advertising outrageous horsepower numbers, and fighting for dominance at the drag strip. But beneath the surface, it wasn't only about how big your V8 was, it was about how you could put that power to the ground. Ford had their Cobra jets, Chrysler had the mighty Hemi and bulletproof Dana rear ends, and GM had a stable full of nameplates like the Camaro, Chevelle, Firebird, and GTO. But what really set GM apart wasn't always obvious. While competitors leaned heavily into raw torque and brute driveline strength, GM engineers quietly slipped something into their performance playbook that redefined how power translated into performance. This secret weapon wasn't marketed with flashy brochures. It wasn't a gimmick or a decal on a quarter panel. It was a piece of engineering so effective, it helped even modest GM cars punch above their weight. Rivals dismissed it at first until they started losing. The birth of GM's hidden edge. To understand GM's hidden weapon, you need to picture the late 1950s and early 1960s. Detroit was bursting with innovation. Automakers were experimenting with new transmissions, differential designs, and suspension layouts. GM, being the giant that it was, had divisions like Chevrolet, Pontiac, Oldsmobile, and Buick, each competing internally for performance dominance. In this crucible of competition, GM engineers realized something vital. You could give a car all the horsepower in the world, but if the drivetrain and suspension weren't designed to harness it, you were wasting potential. While Chrysler focused on heavy-duty axles and Ford tried to brute force their way into reliability, GM sought finesse. Their answer? A drivetrain and suspension system that worked together as a unified package, delivering both strength and efficiency. This secret was baked into the design of their transmissions, rear differentials, and suspension geometry. It wasn't about overbuilding, it was about balance. GM's innovation meant their cars launched harder, handled better, and sustained power runs without braking. The brilliance of this approach also came from the fact that it worked across different platforms, from mid-size muscle cars to luxury cruisers. Instead of building one-off specialty systems, GM engineered solutions that could be scaled. This meant their edge wasn't limited to a halo car, it was everywhere in the lineup, hiding in plain sight. And at the heart of this system were two key pieces of technology: the Turbo Hydromatic 400 transmission and the 12-bolt rear differential. The Turbo Hydromatic 400, unsung hero of the streets. If there was one piece of engineering that quietly tipped the scales for GM, it was the Turbo Hydromatic 400, often abbreviated TH400. Released in 1964, this automatic transmission was unlike anything competitors had at the time. It was designed for high performance, built to handle massive torque loads, and engineered with precision that made it both reliable and versatile. While Mopar's torque flight gets its fair share of credit, the TH400 was just as revolutionary. GM designed it with a simple yet rugged 3-speed configuration that could take abuse at the drag strip without flinching. Racers quickly discovered that this transmission wasn't just tough. It shifted fast and clean, allowing cars to stay in their power band without hesitation. Its cast iron construction, advanced fluid dynamics, and efficient gear ratios gave drivers a blend of durability and performance that felt years ahead of its rivals. Pontiac GTOs, Chevy Chevelles, Buick GSs, and even the mighty Oldsmobile 442 all benefited from this gearbox. Even GM's luxury cars like the Cadillac Eldorado used the TH400, which shows just how versatile and reliable it was. For racers, swapping in a TH400 became the go-to move for turning a street car into a strip-dominating weapon. What made it so deadly as GM's hidden weapon was its combination of strength and accessibility. Unlike specialty parts that required custom setups, the TH400 was mass-produced and widely available across GM's lineup. That meant everyday enthusiasts could walk into a dealership, order a performance car with one of the most bulletproof transmissions of the era, and hit the road ready to race. Even decades later, the TH400 is still celebrated in drag racing and hot rodding circles, proving that GM's unsung hero wasn't just a product of its time, it was a blueprint for how to outthink the competition. The 12-bolt differential, GM's backbone of strength. Complementing the TH400 was another underrated piece of GM engineering, the 12-bolt rear differential. Introduced in 1965, this axle was designed to handle the rising horsepower wars without snapping under pressure. It wasn't just an upgrade, it was a declaration that GM understood the future of performance cars. Engines were getting bigger, torque numbers were climbing, and the old 10-bolt rears weren't up to the challenge. The 12-bolt arrived as the answer, a fortress of gears and steel ready for battle. Competitors like Ford often relied on their 9-inch rear end, which was certainly tough, but GM's 12-bolt brought a perfect balance of strength and efficiency. Its larger ring gear diameter, improved carrier design, and robust construction meant it could endure hard launches and sustained abuse at the drag strip. And just like the TH400, it wasn't reserved for rare or exotic cars. It was available in bread-and-butter models like the Chevelle SS, Camaro Z28, and Nova SS. For muscle car enthusiasts, this was a game-changer. Instead of constantly worrying about breaking parts, GM owners could focus on dialing in performance. The 12-bolt gave them confidence to push their cars harder, knowing the rear end wouldn't give up when they needed it most. And the proof was everywhere, from local drag strips where weekend racers laid down consistent times, to national events where factory-backed cars quietly built reputations for resilience. This wasn't just about brute strength either. The 12-bolt also gave GM cars an edge in consistency. Whether you were launching off the line at the drag strip or hammering down the highway, this rear end made sure power delivery was smooth, reliable, and repeatable. Rivals soon learned that while they were chasing horsepower figures, GM had quietly built a foundation that made their cars deadly consistent performers. In a war measured not only by speed but by durability, the 12-bolt was the hidden backbone that kept GM in the fight, and often out front. Suspension. Geometry. The invisible advantage. Beyond the drivetrain, GM also hid another ace up its sleeve, suspension geometry. While Chrysler leaned on leaf springs and Ford relied on more traditional setups, GM's use of coil springs in many of its muscle cars gave them an edge in handling and traction. This was more than just a design choice, it was philosophy. GM understood that muscle cars couldn't live on straight-line speed alone. They needed to hook up at launch, stick through corners, and give drivers confidence on the street. Take the Chevelle SS, for example. With its coil spring rear suspension, it offered a balance of ride comfort and performance that competitors struggled to match. At the drag strip, this meant better launches with less wheel hop. On the street, it meant sharper handling without sacrificing daily drivability. Suddenly, GM cars weren't just quarter-mile missiles. They were versatile machines that could cruise, commute, and carve curves, all in the same package. This subtle but significant engineering choice made GM cars more versatile. They weren't just quarter-mile heroes, they were machines you could drive to work during the week, then take to the track on the weekend. And that versatility expanded GM's dominance, attracting not only hardcore racers but also everyday buyers who wanted a car that could do it all. Word of mouth spread fast. Car magazines praised GM for combining comfort and muscle in a way few rivals could match, and buyers started to notice the difference. Pontiac, the division that showed it off. No discussion of GM's hidden weapon would be complete without spotlighting Pontiac. If GM as a whole had the engineering edge, Pontiac was the division that showcased it with flair. The GTO, often called the first true muscle car, wasn't just about dropping a big engine into a mid-size body. It was about pairing that power with GM's secret sauce. And Pontiac wasn't shy about showing off what they had. Their ads, their marketing, even the way the cars drove, all of it leaned on the fact that these machines weren't just fast, they were dependable performers. Pontiac engineers like John DeLorean knew that selling performance wasn't just about horsepower numbers. It was about how the car felt, how it launched, and how it delivered thrills consistently. The combination of the TH400 transmission, the 12-bolt rear, and coil spring suspension meant the GTO wasn't just fast, it was reliable. That reliability built a reputation that made the GTO the face of an entire movement. And buyers noticed. They weren't just buying a car, they were buying confidence, a guarantee that their investment wouldn't crumble after a few hard runs. By the late 1960s, Pontiac's formula had spread across GM's divisions, with Chevy, Buick, and Oldsmobile all leveraging the hidden weapon to build their own muscle legends. From the Chevelle SS 396 to the Buick GSX, GM cars carried an engineering advantage that Detroit doesn't like to admit today. They didn't just build fast cars, they built cars that stayed fast. That subtle distinction was everything. It was why GM cars dominated stoplight showdowns, weekend drag races, and why their reputations have endured for decades. And Pontiac, with its bold marketing and fearless engineering, was the loudspeaker that broadcasted GM's advantage. Every burnout, every quarter-mile pass, every glossy ad showing a GTO roaring down a strip of asphalt was a demonstration of what GM had secretly perfected behind the scenes. From the street to the strip, GM's secret at work. By the late 1960s, the performance battlefield had shifted. It wasn't just about showroom bragging rights anymore. It was about what happened when the Christmas tree turned green on a quarter-mile track. Here's where GM's hidden advantage truly revealed itself. While competitors showed up with flashy Hemi decals or screaming Cobra Jet logos, GM's racers leaned on something less obvious: the durability and consistency of their drivetrains. With the turbo-hydromatic 400 transmission, the 12-bolt rear differential, and coil spring suspension setups, GM cars could take beating after beating without grenading their parts. Racers could launch harder, run more consistently, and return home without worrying about catastrophic failures. That meant more track time, more wins, and a growing reputation that spread across garages and car clubs nationwide. For grassroots racers, it was a godsend. They didn't have corporate sponsorships or deep pockets to constantly rebuild broken parts. What they needed was something that worked, and GM gave it to them. Where Ford drivers cursed broken axles and Mopar owners constantly rebuilt gearboxes, GM racers bragged about reliability. And that reliability wasn't just luck, it was engineering. It was the careful marriage of drivetrain, suspension, and chassis that GM had baked into its cars from the start. That meant every launch, every pass, every victory was another piece of proof that GM had cracked the code. Chevrolet Chevelle SS 396 and 454, the people's champion. Chevrolet's Chevelle SS became one of the most iconic examples of how GM's hidden weapon worked in the real world. At first glance, the Chevelle looked like any other mid-size muscle car. Long hood, clean lines, a touch of chrome, but beneath its skin lay the drivetrain combination that made it so formidable. The 396 big block paired with a TH400 meant brutal launches that didn't shred transmissions. The 12-bolt rear end took everything the engine dished out, even when owners swapped in the monstrous LS 6454 in 1970. And with coil spring suspension, the Chevelle could plant its rear tires better than most leaf spring rivals. This formula turned the Chevelle into more than just another muscle car. It became the reliable street brawler, the car you could count on to win races Friday night and still get you to work Monday morning. Its dominance wasn't only about horsepower numbers, it was about how efficiently that power was delivered. The Camaro and Firebird, pony cars with punch. When Ford introduced the Mustang in 1964, GM had to respond. Their answer came in the form of the Chevrolet Camaro and Pontiac Firebird, both introduced in 1967. But instead of simply copying Ford's formula, GM leaned into its hidden weapon to give these pony cars a sharper edge. Camaro buyers could equip their cars with everything from the TH400 to the 12-bolt, creating pony cars that could handle serious power. Meanwhile, Pontiac's Firebird, especially in Trans Am trim, benefited from GM's suspension geometry, which gave it handling far superior to many of its contemporaries. While Ford's Mustangs were often criticized for axle hop and Mopar's pony entries leaned more toward straight-line power, GM's pony cars became the well-rounded choice. They didn't just look good, they performed with a level of refinement that set them apart. And that refinement came directly from the engineering GM had quietly perfected. Oldsmobile 442, a wolf in gentleman's clothing. Oldsmobile wasn't always the first name on people's lips when it came to muscle cars, but the 442 made sure it wouldn't be forgotten. With its balanced blend of style, comfort, and raw muscle, the 442 showed how GM's hidden weapon could be adapted for different audiences. What set the 442 apart was that it gave buyers the best of both worlds: luxury touches that made it a refined daily driver and a drivetrain setup that could transform it into a weekend drag strip contender. Where the Chevelle SS was brash and aggressive, the 442 was refined. But beneath the polished trim and comfortable interiors lay the same TH400, 12-bolt, and coil spring formula. That meant the 442 wasn't just a luxury cruiser, it was a legitimate threat at the drag strip. Owners quickly discovered they could surprise more hardcore muscle cars with their seemingly gentlemanly Oldsmobiles. In fact, many enthusiasts loved how the 442 flew under the radar, quietly beating more hyped competitors without breaking a sweat. It was the perfect demonstration of GM's philosophy: power is only as good as the system that delivers it. Oldsmobile marketed the 442 with slogans about sophistication and class. But the truth was, this car had teeth, and GM's hidden engineering made sure they bit hard. Even decades later, collectors and racers alike recognized the 442 as proof that muscle didn't have to shout to be deadly effective. Buick GSX, Quiet Thunder. If Oldsmobile represented gentlemanly performance, Buick's GSX was the wolf in sheep's clothing. Buick wasn't exactly known for building muscle cars, but when the GSX hit the streets with its 455 Stage 1 engine, it shocked the automotive world. Here was a car from a brand associated with doctors, executives, and retirees, suddenly rolling up with torque numbers that could humble just about anything else on the road. Once again, the key wasn't just the engine's monstrous torque, it was the drivetrain's ability to handle it. Buick owners didn't worry about snapping axles or blowing transmissions because GM's hidden weapon was already built in. That allowed the GSX to earn a reputation as one of the most underrated monsters of the muscle car era. It didn't just run fast, it ran fast over and over again, proving that Buick's entry wasn't a gimmick, but a serious contender. And here's the irony. While Ford and Chrysler were screaming about their headline engines, Buick quietly built a car that could keep up, and sometimes beat them, without half the marketing hype. That's the beauty of GM's hidden edge. It worked so well, it didn't need to be flashy. Today, the GSX stands as one of the ultimate examples of how GM's engineering allowed even its most unexpected divisions to punch far above their weight class. It was quiet thunder indeed, controlled, devastating, and unforgettable. Racing legacies, GM's edge on the track beyond the street scene, GM's hidden weapon made a massive impact in professional racing. In NHRA drag racing, GM cars became staples because of their ability to survive repeated punishment. Racers knew that running a TH400 and a 12-bolt meant fewer breakdowns and more time chasing trophies. The consistency of these components gave grassroots racers the confidence to push their cars harder, knowing that the drivetrain could handle the abuse. Pontiac's GTOs, Chevrolet's Camaros, and even Novas with modest small blocks turned into weapons thanks to drivetrains that simply refused to quit. And in NASCAR, the consistency of GM's engineering translated into victories that cemented Chevrolet and Pontiac as forces to be reckoned with on the oval. While rivals might boast about raw horsepower, GM was stacking up points, podiums, and championships, proving that durability often won the long game. What's often overlooked today is that many of GM's racing wins weren't just about horsepower. They were about durability, efficiency, and systems that worked together seamlessly. While rival cars might win a few races with sheer power, GM cars often won championships because consistency always beats occasional brilliance. That legacy still echoes in modern motorsports, where the lessons GM pioneered in the 1960s continue to shape how race teams think about performance today. Why Detroit doesn't want you to remember. So why is GM's hidden weapon often left out of the popular muscle car narrative? The answer is simple: horsepower sells. Big numbers on brochures and loud marketing campaigns were the lifeblood of the muscle car era. Chrysler wanted you to drool over the Hemi. Ford wanted you to lust after the Cobra Jet. These were headline grabbers. GM, on the other hand, built its advantage into the bones of its cars. They didn't need to brag about transmissions and differentials because the results spoke for themselves. But in the decades since, that subtlety worked against them. The average enthusiast remembers the big engines, not the engineering decisions that made those engines truly effective. Detroit doesn't want to remind you that GM's strength came from something deeper than brute force, because it changes the story. It proves that the muscle car wars weren't just about cubic inches, they were about smart design. And that truth doesn't fit neatly into the myth-making of the era. Legacy of GM's hidden weapon. Looking back, it's clear that GM's real secret wasn't a single part. It was a philosophy. By prioritizing balance, reliability, and system-wide engineering, GM created muscle cars that could compete at the highest levels and win consistently. The TH400, the 12-bolt rear, and the coil spring suspension might not sound as sexy as a 426 Hemi or a Boss 429, but they were the difference between winning once and winning every time. Today, collectors and racers still hunt down GM cars with these features because they know what they represent: durability, ingenuity, and a hidden advantage that made legends out of everyday cars. Whether it was a Chevelle SS, a GTO, a 442, or a GSX, GM's hidden weapon ensured these cars would stand the test of time, not just as icons of style, but as champions of engineering. Now that you know the truth, the next time someone brings up the muscle car wars, don't just talk about engines. Talk about what really won races. Talk about the transmissions, the rear ends, the suspensions, the pieces that GM engineered so well that Detroit itself doesn't like to admit just how powerful they were. If you love muscle cars, share this story. Keep the memory of GM's hidden weapon alive, because it's not just history. It's a lesson in how smart design can beat brute strength, and how sometimes the greatest advantages are the ones hiding in plain sight.